They called it the cradle of civilization. But beneath the marble temples and grand philosophies, ancient Rome hid a world so twisted, so grotesque, that even its own historians struggled to write it down. This wasn't about love, romance, or passion. This was power, raw, unchecked, and perverted. Behind palace doors, emperors indulged in rituals that blurred the lines between pleasure and punishment, tradition and terror. What happened in Roman bedrooms wasn't just scandalous. It was horrifying. From emperors who forced their soldiers to watch, to children sold into brothels by their own families. This isn't the history you learned in school. Welcome to the dark heart of the empire. These are the most horrifying sexual practices of ancient Rome, and once you hear them, you'll never look at history the same way again, you see, to understand how Rome could become the epicenter of such nightmarish indulgence. You have to begin at the root, the way Romans saw sex, power, and control. Because in Rome, sex was never just about pleasure. It was about domination, about hierarchy, about humiliation. From the lowest slave to the most powerful senator. Every Roman knew your body was never truly your own. In modern times, we separate love from violence, pleasure from politics. But to a Roman, they were one and the same. And it all began in the family home. In the Roman household, the Domus, the father, was law. The paterfamilias, as they called him, held complete power over his wife, his children, even his slaves. That power wasn't just legal. It was physical, emotional, sexual. If a father wanted to punish his son, he could do it without question. If he wanted to discipline his slave girl in the bedroom, no one would bat an eye. It wasn't just accepted, it was expected now. Imagine growing up in that world, where boys were taught that to be manly meant to conquer, to take, to own, and where girls were trained to be silent, obedient, and always available. This wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was baked into Roman law, art, and everyday speech. The statues that modern tourists stare at in museums, many of them aren't celebrating love. They're depicting domination. Gods forcing themselves on mortals. Emperors flaunting their conquests, not in war, but in the bedroom. And if the gods did it, why shouldn't the people? Even language in Latin reflected this twisted code. There wasn't a clean word for homosexual or straight. Instead, there were only words for the dominant and the submissive, the penetrator and the penetrated. To be passive was to be weak. To be feminine, to be mocked. That mindset infected every part of Roman society. In the baths, in the arenas, in the senate halls, and especially in the brothels. But before we get to the red light districts and the palace orgies, we need to start where all horrors begin. Childhood. Because in ancient Rome, innocence wasn't just lost, it was auctioned off. In modern society, childhood is sacred. It's a time to grow, to learn, to dream. But in ancient Rome, for many children, it was a countdown to being sold literally. You see, Roman slavery wasn't limited to war captives or criminals. Many times it began with parents. Desperate, poor, drowning in debt. When food was scarce and taxes high, they sold the only thing they had left, their children, to a Roman slaver. Age wasn't a concern. In fact, the younger the child, the more profitable they were. Boys and girls alike were groomed, trained, and paraded for the elite. These weren't just slaves. They were products in a dark market of lust and power. The empire had no shame about it. A child as young as 7 could be sold into a lupanar, a Roman brothel, and trained for service. These brothels were often marked by phallic symbols carved into the walls, with crude images of acts performed inside. A twisted advertisement. And once you stepped inside, you'd often find children lining the walls. The Roman lupanar, or brothel, wasn't just a place of business. It was a theater of dominance, where human bodies were rented, broken, and discarded. And in the underbelly of the empire, children were its most prized attractions. Let's be clear, these weren't rare hidden places. Pompeii alone had dozens of brothels, each engraved with graffiti and explicit wall paintings that left no doubt about what happened inside. Tourists today gawk at them. Back then, they were routine. Each room or cubiculum was barely large enough for a body to lie down. No doors, no privacy, just stone beds, thin cushions, and a line of customers waiting outside. Most workers inside, many of them just children, didn't speak Latin. They were Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, their names erased, replaced with vulgar nicknames carved into the walls like trophies. Felix the Mouth, Livia the Wild, human souls reduced to menu items. And the worst part? Rome regulated it. Brothel owners paid taxes. Prostitutes were required to register. No one questioned the age of the workers, because no one cared. But these weren't the only places the elite indulged their darkest desires. Wealthy Romans often kept domestic sex slaves, young boys or girls purchased specifically for household use. They were known as delicia, which translates to delights. These children were dressed in fine silks, trained to serve wine, massage, entertain guests, and worse. Even respected philosophers like Seneca wrote letters acknowledging how common it was for noblemen to have pleasure slaves at their dinner tables, sometimes used between courses like casual amusements. And no one batted in. Because for Rome, this wasn't perversion. This was luxury. This was status. A man wasn't judged for what he did, only for how publicly he did it. And the emperors, they took it even further. What they did in the shadows made even the brothels look tame. To rule Rome was to rule the world, and with that power came a level of indulgence that knew no human limit. What the common people did behind closed doors, the emperors did on golden beds in full view of their court, with no shame and no restraint. Let's begin with one of the most monstrous names in Roman history, Tiberius. When he retired from public life, Tiberius didn't seek peace. He built a private kingdom of horror. On the island of Capri, far from the Senate and the people, Tiberius constructed an estate so depraved that even Rome's jaded elites whispered about it in fear. He called it a retreat. Historians called it a flesh palace. It was here that Tiberius, in his later years, surrounded himself with young boys and girls, trained specifically to serve him in ways no words can fully capture. According to Suetonius, a Roman historian, he kept children who had been taught to swim between his thighs in pools of warm water. He called them his minnows. That's not a legend. That's recorded history. These children weren't lovers. They were tools, objects, collected for a perverse emperor's pleasure, like fine wine or statues. And if they resisted, they disappeared. But Tiberius was just the beginning. Enter Caligula, his adopted heir, and a man whose name became synonymous with madness. Caligula didn't just indulge in sexual depravity, he used it as a weapon. He's said to have slept with his own sisters, one of whom he paraded in public as if she were his empress. He didn't care who watched. In fact, he preferred. They did. Senators were often invited to dinner, only to be humiliated by watching the emperor take their wives right there on the banquet floor, then mock their performance over dessert. It wasn't about lust. It was about power. Caligula's palace became a playground of cruelty. He turned parts of it into a brothel, where Roman nobles had to pay to sleep with his hand-picked slaves. The profits went directly to the state treasury. Imagine being forced to pay your emperor for the right to participate in his madness, or worse, to offer your own daughter as a gesture of loyalty. And yet, it got worse, because then came Nero, the boy emperor with a lyre in one hand and fire in the other. If Tiberius was twisted and Caligula insane, then Nero was something else entirely, a creature born of Rome's darkest fantasies. He wasn't just cruel, he was theatrical about it. Every depraved act was a performance. The empire was his stage. Nero ascended the throne at just 16 years old, and by the time he was 20, he'd already begun his descent into unimaginable depravity. He murdered his mother, poisoned his stepbrother, and set fire to his own city. But his sexual appetites were what truly horrified even his loyalists. Nero didn't care about gender. He didn't care about age. He didn't care about consent. He once castrated a young slave boy named Sporus, dressed him in empress robes, and married him in a full public ceremony, complete with dowry, wedding guests, and a Roman priest officiating. Nero called Sporus his bride and took him to public events, demanding others treat the boy as royalty. It sounds theatrical, it's absurd, but it happened. Roman historians wrote about it in grim detail, not out of judgment, but shock. And Nero wasn't content with playing the role of husband in another deranged performance. He swapped roles and dressed himself as the bride, taking a man named Pythagoras as his groom. This time, Nero was penetrated, not for love, but for spectacle. He wanted to be watched. He needed it. Because for him, sex was theater, the kind soaked in humiliation, blood, submission. His palace was more than a royal estate. It was a labyrinth of lust. He had rotating dining rooms with ceilings that rained rose petals and chambers beneath them where he kept boys, girls, eunuchs, and slaves, ready at all hours for whatever play he wished to stage. Some were willing. Most were not. It's said that Nero once dressed in animal skins and attacked people tied to stakes, mimicking a wild beast, biting, scratching, and raping them, all while his court cheered, too afraid to disobey. For him, this wasn't madness. It was art. It was Roman decadence in its final form. And when Rome finally turned on him, when rebellion arose and the people begged for his head, Nero didn't face justice like a man. He fled like a coward. Then, trembling and surrounded, he stabbed himself in the throat, his last words, "What an artist dies in me." But his death didn't mark the end of Rome's depravity, because long after Nero's ashes cooled, the empire continued to rot from the inside out. Rome was built on conquest, was obsessed with domination. It comes as no surprise that even in the bedroom, especially in the bedroom, its elite turned sex into a battlefield. What we now call fetishes. The Romans called indulgentia, indulgences. But this wasn't about harmless curiosity. No, these were desires rooted in humiliation, in cruelty, and spectacle. Let's start with the public sex shows. Yes, you read that right. In some elite Roman banquets hosted by the likes of emperors, generals, and senators, sex acts were performed live, not behind curtains, not in private, but on platforms like dinner entertainment. Some even forced gladiators and slaves to perform these acts as a form of twisted tribute. And when the elite wanted to participate, they did. They'd pull a servant out from behind a curtain or underneath the dining table and take them right there. While others laughed, clapped, or bet on what would happen next. But the fetishes didn't end there. Voyeurism was rampant. Some noblemen built secret rooms with peepholes into servant quarters and bathhouses. Others paid too. Watch virgin girls be broken in by animals? Yes. Animals, a practice so disturbing that even some Roman writers described it with horror. This wasn't widespread, but it did happen, and it was always orchestrated by the wealthy, the powerful, it's the untouchable. And then came the fetish for pain, not just inflicting it, but weaving it into acts of intimacy. Roman erotic poetry, especially by writers like Martial and Catullus, often fantasized about bruising, biting, bleeding, the blending of lust and punishment. Some Roman men paid to be whipped by dominant women dressed as goddesses. Others whipped their own slaves before or during sex, believing that suffering purified the act. It wasn't just sadism, it was ritualized cruelty. The stola. The Roman woman's traditional dress was sometimes torn off in public to shame and expose. Married women, especially among the elite, were expected to play along, smiling through forced encounters. Or worse, being loaned out to visiting guests as a gesture of political alliance. Your wife? As a bargaining chip. And let's not forget the cult sex, where worship crossed into possession. In certain religious sects, like the cult of Bacchus, drunken rituals blurred into orgies. Reports describe women screaming, men writhing, boundaries dissolving under wine and incense. In some versions, children were present either as witnesses or victims. We can't say for certain how far those nights went, but we know the Senate tried to outlaw them, which means they happened, frequently so. Ask yourself this: if the most powerful men in Rome could burn cities, kill their families, and crown themselves gods, what then could possibly restrain them behind closed doors? In Rome, Slavery wasn't just legal, it was essential. The empire didn't run without it. But some slaves weren't bought for labor, or war, or farming. Some were bought for pleasure. And only that they were called verni, puari, or ancilla, terms that sound harmless now, but in Roman times they marked you as property, flesh, bought, sold, and used, the most desired. Young, foreign, attractive, and preferably silent. The pure delicatus, literally delicate boy, was one of the most coveted commodities in Upper Roman society. Wealthy men purchased them as status symbols. These boys were pampered on the outside, dressed in fine robes, bathed in expensive oils. But behind the silken perfume was a brutal truth. They were sex toys for the elite, and when they aged, when their voices cracked or their bodies matured, they were discarded. Some were sold back into harsher slavery. Others were simply executed. It was the same for young girls, especially those taken from conquered provinces. The further from Rome they came, the more exotic they were considered. Syrian girls, Nubian girls, Gauls, Britannians, paraded like treasures, broken in silence. Some were trained from birth to serve in elite Roman homes, not to clean or cook, but to seduce. Taught how to dance provocatively, how to bathe their masters, how to obey without flinching. They were expected to smile, to appear willing. Even if they were only 12, even if they were in pain, even if their minds had long since shut down, and Rome had no laws against it. A master could do anything to a slave, anything, and no one would raise a finger. Slaves had no personhood. If a master killed a slave, it was considered property. Damage, that's all. And don't think these horrors were confined to back rooms and dungeons. They happened in public, too. In some Roman villas, guests would be greeted at the entrance by nude slave boys, standing still like furniture. During feasts, girls would serve wine with nothing on but a collar. Some were ordered to sit beneath tables, not to eat, but to be touched, fondled, or used by guests as part of the entertainment. It was normalized, even expected. Roman art shows it, so do their poems. And their historians, like Tacitus and Juvenal, describe these scenes not with outrage, but with the bored tone of men who'd seen it all before, because they had. Because in Rome, a body wasn't sacred. It was a tool, and the ones who suffered. Most, they didn't even speak the language. They had no voices, no names, no tombs, just bruises that faded, and lives that didn't last long enough to matter. In the Roman world, love was not a virtue. Lust was tolerated. Obsession was expected. But love, real, mutual, emotional love, especially between equals, was considered weak. Even dangerous, because Rome didn't just sexualize power, it weaponized it. In Roman society, there was only one rule when it came to sex. You dominate or you are dominated. That wasn't just a bedroom philosophy. It was law, culture, identity. It defined who you were. A free Roman male citizen could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, even young boys, and still be considered virtuous as long as he was the penetrator. But the moment he showed softness, submission, emotion, he was shamed, mocked, labeled effeminate, even if two adult men had a consensual, loving relationship. The one seen as passive, the one who received, was branded sinidus, a slur so potent it could ruin a man's political career. You could win battles, write laws, build monuments, but if you loved like a woman, you were no man at all. So many men hid. They married for politics, get their real lovers as slaves or secret companions, even branded. Their lovers to avoid accusations of equality, a twisted way of proving he belongs to me. He's not my equal. He's my property. And women, they had it worse. A Roman woman's honor was tied entirely to her chastity, and yet she had no control over her own body. Her husband could force her to have sex. Her father could marry her off at 12. If she was raped, she could be blamed. And if she was caught in an affair, even a consensual one, she could be exiled, mutilated, or killed. But her husband, he could visit brothels, sleep with slave girls, castrate boys, and call them concubines. And no one would bat an eye, because he was a man. And Roman masculinity, real masculinity, was about control, not emotion, not affection. Just conquest. Even poets who dared to write about love, like Ovid, were punished. Ovid's poems about seduction, romance, and pleasure scandalized Augustus so deeply that he was exiled from Rome for corrupting public morals. And what were those? Morals. Men could sleep with children. Women couldn't fall in love. That was Roman virtue. That was Roman shame. And that warped morality would shape not just their empire, the foundations of Western sexuality for centuries to come, you might think. That religion would be a boundary, a moral shield against Rome's sexual depravity. But in ancient Rome, religion didn't restrain lust. The wedding ceremony served as a constant reminder that their childhood was officially over. Even if actual consummation was delayed, Isabella went through this ritual at age 6 dolls in all, knowing that she was now someone's property. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but these ceremonies weren't just about tradition. They were about control, ownership, and public verification of what should have been the most private moment in a couple's life. Childbirth, a death sentence if you thought the wedding night was traumatic. Wait until you hear about what came next in medieval times. Getting pregnant wasn't a blessing, it was essentially playing Russian roulette with your life every single time. Let's return to Margaret Beaufort, because her story perfectly illustrates the nightmare of medieval childbirth, remember? She was only 12 when Edmund Tudor got her pregnant when Edmund died of plague while she was 7 months along. Margaret had to make a dangerous winter journey to Pembroke Castle while heavily pregnant. For a 13-year-old girl, this was almost unthinkable. On January 28, 1457, Margaret went into labor, according to her confessor,